I'm Michel, and thank you all for being here, and the organizers for inviting me. It's my first time in New Zealand. Wonderful opportunity. And I have a story which is kind of extraordinary also for me. I'm a medical doctor by training, and I never thought I would address a conference of mostly people in the ag business. So we started, if this is starting, right. So we produced a hamburger, as Michel already said, out of stem cells from a cow. Now, why would you do that? We have cows happily grazing, especially here in New Zealand, high quality meat, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it. However, there are a couple of things wrong with it in the future, in the near future. And I have these two people, and I have a video with two people. One is Richard Wrangham from Harvard. He is a biological anthropologist, explaining, this is the good news, why we are in his words, species designed to love meat. Who of you is vegetarian, by the way? Not that many people. Which was kind of expected, I guess. So apparently that will resonate with you too. We are a species designed to love meat. But on the other hand, I have Ken Cook, director of the Environmental Working Group in California, who explains what the issues are with growing meat from livestock, as some of you are doing. And it's provocative, but that was the intention of the video. So, but the idea, I think, are important. Let's see where it wants to start.
The story of human evolution is one that is intimately tied to meat. Once we started cooking meat, then we could get lots of energy, and that energy enabled us to have big brains and become physically, anatomically human. Hunters and gatherers all over the world are very sad if, for a few days at a time, the hunters come back empty-handed. The camp becomes quiet, the dancing stops, and then somebody catches some meat. They bring the prey into the camp, or nowadays into somebody's back garden with a barbecue. Everybody gets excited to come and share the meat. It is ritually cut and passed out to people. We are a species designed to love meat.
Feeding the world is a complex problem. I think people don't yet realize what an impact meat consumption has on the planet. 18% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from meat production. We're also using something like 1,500 gallons of water to produce just 1 pound of meat. Meat takes up about 70% of our arable lands. There's no question that if we were able to shift more of our land into intensive fruit and vegetable production, we'd be able to feed a lot more people a lot healthier diet. With the global population growing from 7 billion to 9 billion people, by 2050, the demand for meat will double. We can't just continue doing what we've been doing. Unless we make some changes in how we produce meat on this planet, we're in for a terrible reckoning.
Meat consumption was part of the human species. It's been fantastically beneficial for us. And now, by some horrendous irony, it's become part of a system that threatens our species. We have to do something about it.
So those are the issues. Good side, we are a species designed to love meat. For the meat producers among you, that will be the good news. Bad news is a lot of resources are going into that meat production, and with a consequence of impact on the environment. And you can argue the numbers, but there is undeniably an influence on the environment. So what can we do? I'm going to use this one. Oops, now it's so we can all become vegetarian. And you know, this audience shows that it's not very easy to become vegetarian, although it looks very appetizing, and you can argue that it's much healthier for you as well. There are 2 billion people on this planet who are vegetarian, mostly involuntarily because they cannot afford meat. but they lead normal lives. We don't need the animal proteins. We talk about, and I heard it this morning, high quality proteins as in dairy and meat. It's all very nice, but in effect we don't need them. We can do without. So we have to find arguments for people to still consume them. But we also have to mitigate the consequences of the production. So it's not only that it's apparently difficult for you and also for me to become vegetarian, it's also that meat consumption, that demand for meat in 2050, that increase by 70 or 100% or whatever it's going to be, doesn't come from going from 7 to 9 billion people. You can do that math, that doesn't add up. It comes from increasing meat consumption in India and China. This is the Humantrophic Level. It's where we are in the food chain. 1 is a plant, 2 is an animal that eats plants, 3 is an animal that eats animals that eats plants. And so we are in the industrialized society at 2.3, 2.35, and you see the pink line here. This is where India and China gradually are creeping up to, and that has been that has started about 30 years ago. And that Humantrophic Level is linearly correlated with the gross domestic product of a country. So as soon as a country becomes richer, middle class incomes rise in numbers, meat consumption goes up. So we have to deal with that increase in demand. And if we cannot really increase production because we're already using a lot of space, arable space for feed production and for grazing of animals, then meat will become a scarce item. We have to sell no to consumers, and it will become really expensive. So in 1932, Winston Churchill said that at some point we will see the absurdity and leave the absurdity of growing an entire chicken if we only eat the breast and the legs. And he was obviously a statesman and journalist, so he didn't know the biology. And he predicted that would be 50 years from then, so in 1980 we are a bit late. And the technology actually wasn't there yet. The technology was there to keep organs alive outside of the body, developed by Alexis Carrel, but not to grow that amount of tissue outside of the body. And especially also not skeletal muscle. Since about 2000, so 15 years ago, the stem cell of a muscle cell, this is a muscle cell, it's a merger of a large number of cells with a very specific structure, a specific protein structure, but it has a lot of nuclei, so it's a merger of cells. And what has been identified is that some of those cells in that muscle fiber are actually stem cells. They are sitting there waiting to repair tissue in case of injury, through division and then through assembly of a new muscle fiber, so that if we rupture a muscle, it gets replaced by muscle and not by scar tissue. Wonderful. Interestingly, these cells can also do that outside of the body. It's an inherent trait of these cells. They're pretty smart in that respect. So what we can do is we can take a small sample of a cow. That has a couple of hundred of those stem cells. It might only be a piece of muscle of 1 centimeter long and 1 millimeter in diameter. We can take out those stem cells, let them proliferate. So we have a biopsy here, separate the muscle cells from the fat cells, let them proliferate. And the proliferation capacity of these cells is enormous, so that from that small sample, you can easily create 10,000 kilos of meat. So you can take many samples from a cow, so you can tremendously multiply the amount of meat that you can produce from that particular cow. Then they need to merge, because that muscle cell is a merger of a number of cells. And interestingly, they do that by, if you starve them. So it's a relatively simple intervention. You just starve them, they start to merge, and they start to become primitive muscle fibers in the lab, in a petri dish, if you like. Then, of course, it's still not a protein-rich fiber, so from that you need to make real muscle tissue, like a Schwarzenegger type of muscle. And they need to perform labor. That's what we all know. You need to physically exercise to beef up your muscle. Fortunately, these cells are also programmed to do that. They start to contract. But if they're floating in that petri dish or just grabbing onto the surface, they won't really develop the tension to in order to sort of trigger that protein synthesis. So for that, we pull a little trick. We let them self-assemble into a tissue. We need to provide a temporary support structure with which they can interact, and then they need to attach to something. And what we did, we basically let them attach to themselves, so we sort of positioned them in a donut shape around a central column, which is kind of elastic. And then in that gel, and they start to reorganize, and they do that all by themselves. They start to reorganize, squeeze out a lot of water, make a fiber, align the fiber, and because they are attached to each other, they now can develop tension, and that tension is the biggest trigger for protein synthesis. So after 3 weeks, we have a muscle fiber that is essentially the same as a muscle fiber that you see in a steak from the supermarket or in a biopsy from your animal. So what we did, we created thousands and thousands and thousands of these fibers. It's initially, it's handmade, so it's expensive and it's kind of tedious work. So my lab members were not all that happy with it. But we made tens and tens of thousands of these fibers, each individually, and we assembled them into a hamburger, the hamburger that you saw earlier. And we decided to present that as a proof of concept to the world, which is for a scientist like me kind of unusual to do. It was a hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference. It was staged in 2013 in London, and it was cooked and eaten. This is a small video of it without sound. We presented it in a Petri dish, which was kind of a gimmick. You see it looks kind of like a hamburger. It was, by the way, worth €250,000. So the chef was really, really courageous in cooking that. Unfortunately, he didn't burn it. It was tasted by 2 food critics, a journalist and a food writer, and they commented that it was okay. It was recognizable as meat, which was a big plus, much better than any of the meat substitutes from vegetable proteins. But it was not great, and it was not worth the €250,000, which we obviously knew. So the point of this whole exercise was that we wanted to show, well, this technology is here, we can do this. And the second is, well, wait a minute, guys, we also need to think about this. We need to start doing this because we are running into issues with meat production and the growing demand in meat consumption. So those were the goals, and I guess we achieved those. So that's fine. Now you have a proof of concept, but you don't have a product because it's $250,000 and it was okay, not much more than that. And obviously it was not, it was just muscle tissue, not the whole complement of meat. So we kind of figured that there were a couple of stages that were really important in making this a product. One is that the production needs to be more efficient than livestock meat production. And obviously you know that there is quite a difference in conversion ratios from the different animals, and from cows it's probably the worst. So that's why it's sort of dubbed the most inefficient way of producing meat. But we still need to show that with this cell culture we can be more efficient. We have everything under control, so we can play with the circumstances, we can play with the feed, we can play with the temperature, we can play with the density of cells, we can play with what we really feed them to make it more efficient. Also, it needs to be sustainable in a very, I mean it in a very limited way. Traditionally, we have been able to culture cells outside of the body for about 120 years. And traditionally we use serum as an additive to the food. And serum is a blood-derived product, and guess what they're coming from? It comes from cows. So if we, in this vision, reduce the number of cows from 1.5 billion on this planet to, let's say, 30,000, I see a couple of you sort of being scared, then we won't have enough blood to culture these cells, so we have to get rid of that serum. So that's the sustainability issue. And finally, it needs to really be meat, because we are not a species designed to love animal proteins. We are a species designed to love meat. We really need to make that product, if you like. Okay, so how do you go about that? So for that hamburger, we grew 30 billion cells. Sounds like a lot, but they are tiny, so this is really what it is. And in a traditional cell culture system, you cannot grow that many cells while being efficient. So we kind of borrow manufacturing systems from bacteria and yeast for instance, pharmaceuticals, which now use 25,000 liter tanks to grow these cells in. Now, the peculiar thing about these cells is that they have to adhere to a surface. They cannot really grow in suspension like bacteria and yeast can. So we had to think of a way to do that, and what you basically use is microcarriers, small plastic little spheres on which these cells can attach, and then the spheres are suspended in the fluid. And by doing that, you can scale it up very easily, go from a 25 milliliter flask to a 25,000 liter tank. You can also increase the density of cells per milliliter of fluid and thereby improve the efficiency. So a very preliminary life cycle analysis from the University of Oxford indicated that in this way you can save basically reduce the amount of land by 90%, amount of water by 90%, and energy by about 60%. Especially the last data has been challenged lately. So, but that can lead to saving of a lot of resources. Now, this is a very busy slide, and that's the intention. It actually should be much busier because on the x-axis there are a number of culture conditions. And we now have tested about 400 of these conditions, and on the y-axis there's a number of cells. And you see all these peaks at 4 days. These are all conditions that contain this blood-derived product, this serum, so they do very well. But you also see a couple of conditions here with the blue arrows that work almost the same as the serum, but they now contain a substitute for the serum, which is basically synthetic proteins that are identified as part of that serum that is important for growth of cells. So we're almost there in eliminating the serum from these cell culture conditions. Now, in terms of mimicry, we need to make sure that the color is the same, the texture is the same as meat, and that the taste is the same. Fortunately, the tasters who tasted that first hamburger, and I agree with them, said that the texture was fine. Texture was really meat-like, much more than any of the other protein substitutes. The color, you saw the color, it was okay. It looked like meat, but that's because we stained it with red beet juice and with saffron, because red beet juice is really purple, not red. So that was cheating. We basically said that we did that, so it was not really cheating. But the color of meat comes from a protein called myoglobin. And that also is the provider of heme, iron, in our meat. So it's a nutritional value, it probably adds to the taste, and it definitely adds to the color. So, because we are culturing our cells under ambient oxygen conditions, the expression of this protein actually is somewhat reduced. So if we culture these cells under low oxygen conditions, which is very easy to do, you can increase that expression by 5-fold. And then the cells become pink and become meat-like, and they have the iron and the heme, and therefore the nutritional value and hopefully also the taste. The other thing that was lacking from that hamburger was that there was no fat tissue in it. And fat tissue, there's not a lot of medical applications for fat tissue production, as you can imagine, but there are some. And the technology to do that is not really compatible with food production. So we had to redesign that. We can use other stem cells for it. And we had to redesign that and use basically fatty acids that are naturally available also in our body to stimulate those stem cells to become fat tissue. And these are just examples of fat tissue that we have produced and that we can mix with the muscle tissue to improve the texture and the taste of that hamburger. So then the final sort of requirement is that people need to eat this. And when this was presented in London, it was picked up by the popular press with a lot of headlines, frankenfood, yuck, and all this sort of stuff. And that's interesting for me as a scientist, because that yuck didn't really, I could not translate that into anything tangible. Is it, it's fear for the unknown, it's not taste, because nobody has ever tasted it other than those couple of people. And so it's fear for the unknown, whether it's safe, it's unnatural, all those sort of connotations that are pretty emotional and not really rational. So one of the things is, we don't know exactly what it is. We don't know how it's being produced, which is fine. But on the other hand, people eat hot dogs. And most people don't know what's in it. And most people don't know how it's being made. But you eat it. Why? Because, a lot of people eat it and they will stay alive, at least short term. So it's relatively safe and it's regulated. So that's one thing. Safety is a big issue. Second is that and we have talked about this morning, that people want to have control, traceability over how our food is being produced. But that's not really related to the technology. That's how it's being implemented in society. So design students from the University of Eindhoven have developed the story of Pookie. Pookie is a pig, in this case, not a cow. And it's living in a small farm in the center of Auckland. And it has only 3 siblings in the farm, so it's a very small farm. It has a couple of cows and a couple of chickens as well. They are fed by the children from the primary schools, given names. They pet them. Once in a while, they are being poked in the butt to get their stem cells. And in a shed adjacent to the farm, meat is being grown for the entire community in Auckland. So you have full control over how it's being produced. It's an educational thing. There is no transport issues. So it has all sorts of possibilities. Then the final thing this is really the final thing, is that, and this is something that I think we're working against each other here, is that meat is a little bit more than just a food. It's an emotion. It's it's dominance over another species. It's hunting instinct. It's a cowboy romance. Whatever it is, there is a lot more association with meat than just as a food. It's a nutritional value. So we don't have that romance yet with the laboratory. I intend to develop that, but that's something that is not there yet. Okay, so that it was not that bad in acceptance is shown by a couple of surveys that we had in the Netherlands and in Great Britain, where people asked, are you in favor of this? And 68% of the Brits said, yes, this seems like a good idea. And 52% of the Dutch said that they would actually buy it if it was available in the supermarket. So those numbers are sort of indicative. You don't need to take them completely for granted, but they show that there is at least some base of adventurism where people would want to try this. Now the final issue is price. $250,000 or euro for a hamburger is not what you call marketable. And cell culture came from the medical industry, from science, and it's not very cheap. However, it has never been done at the scale where we envision it to be done. So we have worked with the company that's the largest provider of stem cells for medical purposes and asked them the question, what would really be, if you scale this up to this degree, what would really be the cost price of this meat if you consider what the density of cells is that we can get per milliliter and all the cost involved. So they have a model about on this, and we entered our data into that model, and then they came up to our surprise with a cost price of $65 per kilo, which is still very, very high, but it's with the current technology that's just emerging and can be improved in many, many ways. So we think we can do that in the maybe not near future, but in 6 to 7 years. So a thing that has not been discussed this morning, and I think is important in thinking about food, is the animal welfare issue. As I mentioned, as I try to emphasize, I'm more interested in food security and in the environmental aspects. I'm a physiologist. I do animal experiments every day. But for consumers, that is going to change. And the whole concept of what meat is, if there are alternatives that essentially produce the same amount of tissue or the same tissue with the same sensory qualities at a reasonable price, let's assume that we can get there, then the animal welfare issue will, I think, be a decisive part in the consumer choices in the supermarket or in the restaurants. And in my mind, we're now starting a company to scale up production and get regulatory approval. We expect to have the first sort of expensive still product on the market in, let's say, about 4 or 5 years. So in my mind, this is going to happen. I think there is an initial consumer base, and I think there is eventually a large consumer base based on the animal welfare benefits and the perceived other benefits in environment and food security. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments.